Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It's my real pleasure today to introduce Myanna Lahsen, both because of her very interesting topics and research, which you'll find out in a few minutes, but also because she's an old friend of mine from when we both worked together at National Center for Atmospheric Research in Colorado. And it's been quite a few years since I've seen her, so it's great that she could come to Ithaca. So she's also giving a talk, as you can see up here, at the Polson Center, 135 Emerson Hall at 4:45 on Thursday. So please, everybody, if you can, please attend that talk. So Myanna had a postdoc at National Center for Atmospheric Research and at Harvard University's J.F. Kennedy School. And then since she's affiliated both with the Earth System Science Center of the Brazilian National Institute for Space Research, INPE, and at the Wageningen University in the Netherlands. She's trained in social anthropology, social studies of science and technology, and interdisciplinary environmental research. Myanna also studies sociocultural and political dynamics related to global environmental change, environmental sustainability and development, with special attention to science policy interfaces and related knowledge politics in the United States and Brazil. And Myanna's going to be here for the week. I'd like to thank the Polson Institute and the Atkinson Center for funding Myanna's visit to Cornell. Okay, so let's welcome Myanna Lahsen.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes, it's working? Good, good. Hi, it's very nice to be here. Like Peter said, it's nice to reconnect with a friend, and it's always good to share about my research. I love captive audiences. So please come on Thursday as well. And today actually will help to bring up issues that I will address more about what to do about it on Thursday. So hopefully you'll be interested. The title of my talk today is The Challenges of Meat and Media in Brazil, Decoding Manifestations of Climate Skepticism. So I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I look a lot at meaning making, and more recently I've been looking at the role of the media also in shaping how we understand climate change, how we even understand that there is a problem. And that's what I'll show about how that happens in Brazil. There's an outline. First, I'll talk about Brazil and climate change and the role of meat production in its emissions. Then I will talk about Brazil as a world example, which is social science literature, which is very complementary of how Brazilian media have covered climate change. Then I will offer my analysis of Brazilian media's coverage of climate change and show some blind spots in how it is understood even by academics who study media representations of climate change. And I will offer just a few snippets of a political economic analysis. So to show how important it is to look at the political and economic dimensions of the production of knowledge through the mass media. So I'll start with a quote by George Monbiot. Can we change? It's actually not a direct quote. It's a slightly transformed, longer quote, where he asked in a recent piece, rather desperately, going through all the problems that are associated with meat production, both for biodiversity and for the climate. And he says, can we change our diet, or do we find mass death easier to contemplate? So it gives you a sense of how important it is to attend to this issue. But as I will show also, that it's not easy for societies to actually even recognize that it is a problem. Maybe some of you know cowspiracy. Probably most of you, right? So this will echo with that. So looking at Brazil, so first we have to understand, so what does the national emissions profile look like in Brazil? And in Brazil, unlike most of the countries in the world, so basically Latin America, South America, and Africa are exceptions where land use is the greater source of emissions in many countries rather than energy. So usually we think of it as an energy problem. In Brazil, it should be thought of as a land use and specifically a meat production problem, because you have meat production and the soy, which is greatly expanding and destroying the forests, is also used mainly for feed for animals. And so in Brazil, you have, and the numbers are imprecise, but I would say around 60% of emissions are linked to meat and soy. I have 50% here because that comes from the work that you can see up underneath the title, Bustamante and all. They're Brazilian scientists, colleagues of mine in Brazil, where I lived and worked for 15 years. And they came out with a study in 2012 saying, estimate that tying meat production to 50% or more. That was actually a conservative estimate, leaving out transport, et cetera, of meat. So 50% of Brazil's emissions, according to them, was tied to meat production. And so from the, this is very loud, no? That's okay? Okay. But currently, the energy sector is around 22, maybe 25% of Brazil's emissions, and that's up from like in 2010, it was just 15% of the emissions that came from the energy sector, because the country has a lot of renewable sources for its energy. Globally, we know that meat is about 15%, except again, it depends how you calculate it. There are some that even say up to 50%, which is too high an estimate, I would say, but published in Nature Climate Change. And also, it's important to understand how much meat is driving the use of land and therefore causing deforestation. So if we all switched to a plant-based diet, we wouldn't need to have that kind of expansion. A really important part of the economic logic of the expansion of deforestation is that there is a market for the products that are then, produced on the land. So Brazil has become a powerhouse in meat production. It didn't used to, but it developed technologies that allowed it to grow in what is otherwise not very fertile tropical soils. And now it's forecast to just continue this expansion. As you can see, so Brazil is in the red here, and it is the biggest, it's projected to outpace other top beef exporting countries. It's very much, it's a central pillar of its development model now. It didn't used to be that way. It used to be looking to industrial, to manufacturing as a source of growth, but more recently, it has gone back to selling its, using its natural resources in this rather exploitative way that is a threat to sustainability. But so what matters is that people know that they know that it's a threat, and that's what I will be talking about. I just threw this in. This was just a talk that was accessible via Facebook from Cicero Center in Norway last week. And just to say, so the title of it, Brazil, What is Needed to Save the Amazon? And I'm sure probably all of you know the importance of the Amazon for climate, biodiversity. We want to conserve our forests. But everyone is focusing on the Amazon. So everyone thinks, well, if the Amazon is saved in Brazil, then everything is fine. What people don't realize is there are other biomes that are just as important, and some of them are actually richer and more threatened in terms of biodiversity. And a top one, is the Brazilian savanna called the Cerrado. It's a huge area. It covers like more than 2 million square kilometers. And if you want, I have put a reference to an article of mine from 2016, where I really go through it, how important this region is for Brazil and actually beyond Brazil. So it goes also to the point of stabilizing global climate and also for water security for not only Brazil, like 90 or 95% of Brazil, but also for countries around it. So, so it's very important in food, water, energy security, also because Brazil uses a lot of hydroelectricity for power, which is how it maintains a lower carbon emissions profile in the energy sector. But what's happening is that the exploitation of the Cerrado means it is a very, very old biome. The root system is adapted to semi-arid conditions. So a way that it has adapted over millennia is to have very, very deep root system that goes down like 40, 50 meters down. So, and that is the way, through that, it replenishes also the groundwater. So the vegetation is important to maintain the groundwater, and in that sense, the whole hydrological system. And so when you have the deforestation, we're losing this connection to the water. So and also generally drying out and depleting a biome that is extremely important for biodiversity and for climate stabilization. So this is what is going on, and most people don't realize. And also, most of the water that is in, like 75% of the water in the Amazon comes from the Cerrado. So if we lose the rivers, and this is what's happening right now, the rivers are drying out from the great exploitation of it, because this is where you have the agricultural frontier, then you're actually losing the whole water system, including the Amazon, in this process. This is not generally recognized, not even by Brazilians. Most people look to it as a place to exploit because it's just not that lush, beautiful rainforest. I find it beautiful, but people have to learn to see that something is beautiful and to learn that it's valuable. So in terms of the water, it's very important that Brazil is over one of the big aquifers of the world, and the Guarani. And this is a study developed by NASA, where finally they found a way of measuring whether more water was going in than was going out. And that was what they found to be the case in 20-some of the world's 37 largest aquifers. And one of them is the one that's in Brazil. So it's unsustainable use of groundwater, which is also to water so they're pumping it up, right, to maintain the agricultural frontier expansion. An interesting thing is that, so this is being done in the name of business, but here we're actually realizing, and this is coming out in the media also by NASDAQ, in the investment world, that meat is a risk. It's a financial risk now to invest in meat, just like in the fossil fuels at this point. The more we realize that it's a problem, the more people will pressure to divest from the sector. Besides the threat that if you no longer have water, well, then you no longer have production. So is it wise to keep doing and developing in this way when it is not sustainable? And the message increasingly is, no, it's not. But that is still fringe knowledge in Brazil. This study was sponsored by the German development, what's it called, the GIZ, the German Agency for International Cooperation, and also with the Sustainable Business Coalition in Brazil. And what is very interesting, so here you see environmental costs of livestock in Brazil are 20 times higher than revenue. So whereas the Brazilians are being told, we need meat production, because it's like 20%, well, agricultural production is like 20 or 25% of the global gross domestic product. So it's very important, certainly for the economy, but the importance is for the country to begin to think about what can we do differently? Is there another route? Maybe go back to industrialization and focusing on that, because that's where you get more value out of your production. Whereas when you just reap the natural resources, you sell it for very cheap. You don't get a lot of jobs out of in the production process. And what we're finding is that the proceeds go largely to the top, so more to elites, and it doesn't trickle down, doesn't create jobs. So it's not a good development model if you care about poverty and sustainability. And so the environmental cost, this is primarily because of the deforestation, right? Deforestation and also pollution, the great use of pesticides to maintain and sustain this production because of the naturally not very fertile soils. Now then some people may say, well, but the people need the meat to eat, right? We have this notion of the rich countries are the only ones that should reduce meat consumption. But in Brazil, actually, the average person in Sao Paulo eats more meat than the average American. And 81% of Brazilian men, 58% of Brazilian women exceed the maximum intake recommended by the Brazilian Healthy Eating Index, which is a number that's higher than what is recommended in the United States as the maximum intake. Also, so in Brazil, it matters. They are exporting a lot of the meat for money, but also 70 to 80% of the meat produced is actually consumed domestically. The Brazilians love their meat. Looking internationally, the average per person protein consumption exceeds dietary requirements in all world regions in 2009, according to the World Resources Institute. And honestly, I'm not sure how they talk about dietary requirements, because we know we can live on a plant-based diet, right? But, you know, beyond what people need, certainly if they you know, look into sort of this kind of recommendations for what is recommended for intake. So this is across the world and also in Brazil. And it's important, very, very important, like I've been saying already, knowledge. We need to have knowledge that it's a problem. And research shows, this is from a study outside of Brazil, but research shows that there's a direct relationship between knowledge that a healthy diet helps address climate change and people's willingness to consume less meat. Doesn't mean that it's easy, right? But there's a really direct connection. So what people know really matters. Knowledge does seem to be power in this case. Now, so what do Brazilian media say about meat? And I just want to put up here and mention something to you to keep in mind here, that in a place like Nature Climate Change, they don't talk a lot about media as a focus of study in itself. And this was one of the few articles that really focuses on that in Nature Climate Change. And the title was Media Power and Climate Change. And it basically just puts up the theoretical question of, do mass media operate as a watchdog, protecting public interest, or as a guard dog, which is protecting the interests of elites, of the larger power structure? So that puts it up as a question. So it's interesting to think sometimes about how science itself also doesn't ask, you know, sort of critical questions of this sort. But so putting this question, is the media in Brazil a watchdog or guard dog? If you look at the international social science media, they decide that it is a watchdog. It doesn't talk a lot about actually going against interests, but it talks about how well the Brazilian media cover climate change. So here is from an article a few years old by a Brazilian, together with John Urry. Does anyone know the name John Urry? He's a very famous UK sociologist. He died a few years ago. But they did a large, big data study of news output in Brazil, news media, thousands of articles, and mined it and looked at how climate change was represented. And they conclude that Brazil's media coverage on climate change seems ahead of most supposedly more modern societies. Compared with more advanced societies, Brazilian media have engendered and stabilized a high and striking level of climate change concern. And how they found this was because they looked around and there was no climate skepticism. So this is an important strand of scholarship that looks, are there people here, do we find people who are contesting the theory that humans are altering the climate? That is what's generally understood as climate skepticism. And they didn't find that. And so it seems like Brazil is doing really great. And here are other studies by other people also coming to the same, and also putting up Brazil as a positive foil to the US, where we know that climate skepticism has been very important in the national media. So here's a quote. While Brazilians by and large respect the science of climate change and understand the cautionary conclusions of the IPCC, the US population is bitterly divided over the merits of the research. I'm not denying there's some element that's true, but I'm questioning how much Brazilians actually know. They say, he found also, there's a near absence of divergent opinions, and that cultivates consensus, shared high level of concern, and political support for vigorous mitigation policies. So absence of divergent opinions is assumed here to cultivate a consensus, and that is what generates a high level of concern. Now, the high level of concern we do see. The Brazilians have been really, well, just before I get there, here's a third study that finds the same thing. Climate skepticism is largely a US phenomenon. It studied climate coverage in Brazil, China, France, India, UK, and the US, and found that Brazil was where you had the least number of skeptical voices in the media. So these three studies all agree. And like I was going to say, this is from the popular surveys that we've been doing for several decades at this point, and the Brazilians tend to come out on top. This is where, so 90% of Brazilians in this study from 2009 find that global warming is a very serious problem, really up there. US people were, American population was around 44 at this one. And also the Brazilians expressed that they're willing to sacrifice economically for the environment. And this is a study from just last year, where again, Brazil is top. This is for commitment to democratic principles and the belief that global climate change is a very serious problem. In the US, you can find down sort of 2/3 down the list here. So this is very persistent, and they do care. The question is, what do they know? So I did a study here on moving to research that I've been doing. So I started out, I took newspaper data like everyone else, and I put it into different categories of what was the major topic. So policymaking, economic, energy interest, and those were the dominant categories of focus. And a lot of it was policymaking up there internationally, less at the national level. But then I was looking, wow, civil society, culture, which we defined methodological as consumption, lifestyle, there was like nothing. And this question for me was, well, what should be in this category? Because honestly, at that point, I had not started thinking about meat myself. Meat started coming out like 2007. There was a really important study that put this on the map. But it wasn't really on my radar until I started thinking about this. Wow, how come there's nothing on culture and lifestyle? So basically, they're covering climate change, but not very much what can you do about it. So I've been following and mapping the media. Here, Globo and Folha de Sao Paulo are two of the top most read newspapers in Brazil. And combined over 12 years, 2007 to 2018, there was over 10,000 articles that mentioned climate change. So I used 3 terms for climate change and used an online database to retrieve the articles that I then analyzed. These were the terms I used in Portuguese. Are there any Brazilians here? Hey, okay. So you can chip in if you disagree. So so I've done various things with this data, but one of the things I did was that then I took these articles that mentioned climate change, and then I did searches for words for meat, cattle, and cow in Portuguese, and also for energy-related terms, to see how these topics were covered and how frequently they appeared. And what I saw very clearly, so if you put here, so here are references to meat versus biofuels and variants in these articles. This is just in one of the newspapers for up to 2011. And so you can see out here, so biofuel was in gray, ethanol is in green, alcohol, which is just another term for ethanol, is in the darker green. But imagine if I put all the greens on top of each other, how high that would go relative to the brownish so colors in the bottom, which are the references to meat, cattle, and cow. And here, this is a raw result in the sense that I did not go through and at this point and check that all these references to meat actually was relevant to climate change. So this is even more than references that actually were. And that's what I will show you of where, I did more refined analysis after this. So biofuels was, how do we understand that there's more? Why do you think that there's more of the green than the red? Does anyone know what was going on with biofuels around 2007? Yeah?
Petroleum prices were going up, so there was probably renewed interest in alternative fuels.
What was going up, sorry?
Petroleum prices were going up.
Yes, so there was a big investment in biofuels for a variety of reasons, also environmental reasons. And it was really a big boom. And the president at the time, President Lula, was really promoting this. You can find his voice all over these articles that I've been looking at. He's saying biofuels is a way for Brazil to develop. It is a model for other developing countries also, that they can have green development. Just a problem appeared though, which was that food prices then spiked up around that time. So whereas it seemed great at first to have all this investment in the biofuels, then there was this problem that it was crowding out food production, and then the prices were going up and the poor could not get food. So there is this trade-off, or it's like we can't just expand and expand and it has no consequences. So that's also, there's been a waning in the interest in biofuels over the years. So you can see there was that peak around 2007, and then it went down. But it continues to be way, way more represented in the media. And so why is there more of this? Well, there are economic interests. When I was flying in and out of Brazil at the time, you could always sense it. You would see people from the business world that were going to Brazil, and they were looking at the biofuels. So very important time and boom of this sector in Brazil. So when there are economic interests that are favorable, you get coverage. But when you have interest in meat, and then the message around the meat would be that it's negative for the climate and therefore not a good investment, you find less. So economic interests are part of shaping what we see in the national media. This is just a graph showing also that you actually had a deep dip in the number of climate change mentioning articles through the years. So there was this peak around 2009, which is when we had the climate meeting, negotiate the COP meeting in Copenhagen, huge time. And then since then, it's really gone down. So that's interesting to think about too, that even though the problem is certainly only getting more important, the media doesn't always reflect that. Right? The media is not like a mirror of what should be and of the real nature of the problems. This is just an example of what, so I looked at all these references to consumption, and then I saw what were the objects of those references. And so, for example, in Global in 2014, there were 303 articles that mentioned climate change. There were 118 references to some kind of, conjugation of the word consume, consumption. And in energy, the references of those references to energy came to 63. And water was also high at that time, 33. Agriculture, which is then why we're using the water. I mean, in Brazil, like 80% of the water is used, or maybe even 90% is up there, is used for agriculture. But agriculture only appears 3 times. So what is driving these problems is not really there, or meat, just one reference in top national newspaper in all of the articles in a year. And this is then looking at the longer span. So what I did was a detailed analysis of the articles that mention climate change. And you can't quite see because of that, but so I took this represent just the articles that acknowledge problems associated with the production or consumption of meat. So in these 10,241 articles, I found only for 12 years, 53 brief references. And I have up here an example of what a brief reference is. The greenhouse gases emitted by food consumed in the UK are equivalent to 167 million tons of carbon dioxide, and switching to a vegan or vegetarian diet would reduce that by 22 to 26%. So I'm talking about references that are in the middle of the body of an article, right? Just a single, and I counted that. And there were just 53 of this kind of brief references that doesn't go into depth, that just might be a famous person saying, I'm vegetarian because I'm trying to save the environment. I counted that. Just in all of this coverage, that's how many are found. Now, detailed discussion was not dedicated articles. It was just something like what you can see here. There's this one paragraph saying a new study by the Chatham House, which is in the UK, that cares about this issue. indicates that approximately 15% of pollutants that produce global warming derive from meat production, partly from methane, from animals' digestion or manure, etc. So that one paragraph is one of these detailed discussions. But of those that actually mention this problem of meat and consumption of meat specifically, just 20 in all of this data. So what we're talking about is a huge national taboo on a topic that is absolutely essential for the well-being for the country. So it is suppressing, in that sense, national discussion about this problem, which is extremely important. You know, and this is, I'll get to the part of skepticism in just a bit. Then I also mapped who said what. So of the discussions of specifically less meat as a solution. So this is where, and this I haven't counted up to 2018 like the other slide you just saw, so it's more limited. But so I put in the categories of people: scientists, journalists, NGO, public persons like famous people or some politicians, and into foreigners and Brazilians. And there I saw that all of the references to in substantial detail about meat as a problem were all from foreigners. It was mostly by scientists and all from foreigners. So whereas in Brazil, you can see they were mostly brief references. So there were actually many brief references, but they would not go into detail about the problem. Now, some of that is that the media muffle it out, and I have examples of that. But I also know that Brazilian scientists are actually really timid about talking about this problem because it has consequences. And I can give an example of the study that I mentioned, the Bustamante, that pointed out that 50% of the emissions or more are tied to meat. It was a hard time for them afterwards. They were being told that they were not good citizens, they were not being good Brazilians because Brazilians need the meat for the economy, etc. So it was hard. They were being attacked, they were being criticized. And none of them has taken forward this line of study of in the future. So we have to also think about, what about the scientists, right? This is just a snapshot I took at a conference in Brazil where there was a summary about food security and climate change. So the country's experts, they would not talk about the need to reduce consumption. They would talk about the need to intensify production, which means to confine it more in area, to produce more cattle on the space in areas that already are deforested rather than deforest more. And the reference to an article there is an article that was in Nature Climate Change, where you had federal researchers in Brazil, and what they in publishing in Nature Climate Change, saying you can actually increase beef production and lower greenhouse gas emissions if you decouple it from deforestation. Now, how you decouple it, I won't go. It's not very clear. But what's interesting is that you get this kind of knowledge coming from Brazilian researchers who are in an institution where there are incentives to not, and disincentives to talk about some of these, meat as a problem. Here's another example. This is a pamphlet where you had a scientific advisor who was also, in a way, knew very well of the meat problem, but the cows are not in this picture, right? There's even someone painting the roof, and honestly, I think the paint should have been in white, right, to change the albedo effect. But you have someone biking, you have someone planting a tree, but there's no cow there, right? So even in a pamphlet which is to educate the people about climate change, cows are not mentioned. And now I'm getting to the issue of the skepticism. So these studies that I showed you, they found that there was no significant climate skepticism. But one of the patterns, one of the patterns that I found was that there was actually quite a lot, considering how little there was that was skeptical of meat, right? These references that were skeptical of meat that I've shown you. Then I found that on some years, there was more coverage or articles that were refuting the concern about meat as a problem, right? So there was very little anti-meat coverage, but you had sometimes even more anti-meat criticisms. So that is a kind of skepticism in itself. So this is what I'm showing in the case of Estado de Sao Paulo, which is another newspaper. And I just picked just 1 year here. So you had 5 articles or references, but it was really only one, which was about 400 words that was critical of meat. And that same year, you had a refutation of concerns about meat that was comes up to 4.6 times longer. And also, often these were very emphatic in how they would talk about it. So here is my translation of one of them. I won't read the whole thing, but there are terms like greenism is a fanatical spirituality, reheated communism, it's like a watermelon, green outside, red inside. And this is rhetoric that we also get in the US anti-environmental movement. Exactly that, this notion of the watermelon comes from there. So you get a very rapid kind of, forceful anti-environmentalist coverage if you start looking. And what's also interesting about it is that many of these were editorials. So here are editorials from Globo, Estadão, where you can see in green, I have translated just some parts, but here's one. So certain prophets of apocalypse issue catastrophic predictions without any scientific basis. Some of the hastiest of these environmental terrorists have attributed Brazil's climate problems to global warming and to livestock production. The supposedly negative effects of Brazilian livestock industry. So what comes through, what you can see is that there is a skepticism of science, of scientific knowledge. Right? It's not focused on the theory of climate change. So it's not saying humans don't cause it. They're just saying, we don't believe the science about meat as a problem for climate change, right? So the anti-environmentalism focuses around where there are economic interests. And there you have to also think about Brazil as a country which in the international arena hasn't had binding commitments. So it doesn't matter. In the US, there's been this pressure, and this is why the US opted out. They didn't want to adopt binding commitments to reduce their emissions. And now there's, things have changed with the Paris Agreement, but for a long time, Brazilians were just without commitment in the international arena. And then you don't really have to care as much about whether what they say about climate change, because you don't have to do anything anyway, right? But then once there was pressure on Brazil to do more, to take more commitments, you've also seen a step up in refutations of the science and of climate change as a problem. Here's another one. And whoever faults the agro-livestock sector for the planet's grave environmental problems is mistaken. And this is someone who is being considered to become a director of Brazil's Embrapa, which is their agricultural institute. So if you want to get to high positions of power in the Brazilian federal system, you have to toe certain lines, or you risk your reputation. So there are incentives in science as well to not take on certain topics. This is an article of mine in which I do an analysis of just one newspaper and certain years. But you can go to that if you want to see some of these numbers of how it comes out. And also I do a more qualitative analysis of it, and it shows just how they try to circumvent and prevent that there are more sort of real strong conclusions that we need to do something to reduce meat production and consumption. So one of the things I also show is that whenever there was this sense that was transmitted through the newspapers that reduced attention, concern, and agency, so the power to act and to do anything about it. So the coverage didn't put that forward, like what you can do to change climate change. So there's that dimension as well of the coverage, which is how they describe things also matters for how people perceive that they can actually change things and that they should. So I want to talk a little bit then about the, how to understand this. What is it that is going on? And I've already been giving a running commentary throughout, right? But what's interesting is that this issue of political economic analysis or political economy is something that's not as common, it's not as mainstream in academic research. And because politics, oftentimes we think politics is something we should not do because we are objective. And, so we know of Marxism and that is very good example of political economic analysis, right? You look at the power structures and how they shape the economic structures, right? So I want to bring out some aspects of that around media and to point out that this is what was missed. So these articles that talked about the media is doing so well, they were not looking at who owns the media in Brazil. How does that work? How is that interconnected with politics? And so if you look, this was one of the 3 studies, right, that found that the climate skepticism is largely a US phenomenon. And the explanation that the authors offered in this report and also in another one that they derived from the report, they said that in Brazil, there's an absence of well-organized and funded lobby groups linked to the fossil fuel industry. And also there's considerable business and political clout behind renewable energies. And this means this translated into the little political and ideological space for right-wing think tanks, feeding skeptical arguments. So, and there is another place they do say there are agricultural interests, but basically many in that industry are also very concerned about the environment. They don't say how they derived, how many said that, just very kind of a loose analysis, let's say. And it's just not really getting at what's actually the case. So we have to be very careful when we analyze that we're portraying things correctly. And also look at, so the first one, absence of lobby groups linked to the fossil fuel industry. Well, that's true up to a certain point, but Brazil has also found oil, right? Found oil, and a lot of oil in 2007. And, but agricultural interests are the ones that are most important, but somehow, looking through the lens of someone who's so used to seeing climate change as an energy problem, there's this tendency to just think that if there's no fossil fuel lobby, let's say that there's not, or not a strong one, then there's no pressure from industry. But this is not understanding how the media actually works in Brazil. This is from a study of investigative journalists who found that lobby activities in Brazil are unregulated and barely visible. And this is because industry groups are already favored by the country's political system. Polluting industries don't have to open campaigning to influence public, they don't have to do open campaigning to influence public opinion and government decision making. So there's a sense that things are already so favored. And one of the ways in which it's favored is through the development programs, which is very much government support for this, and strategy is to develop in the Amazon. And if you pick up the government plans for, in the Cerrado, and if you pick up the national development plans, there's actually not even talk about the detrimental environmental consequences of it. So the government is in and facilitating, and so the industry doesn't have to be out there and pamphleting and being obvious. They are already so favored by the system. And it also matters that the agricultural interests are very much part of the elite in Brazil, and they're very, and often are media owners as well. And often those are also politicians. So you have a place, because traditionally what has happened in Brazil is that, so the large landowners were the elite. Then they wanted to get into to have power. They would buy the local media, and they would use the local media to get elected. So they shaped public opinion to get elected and get into the government. And once they were in the government, then they also could regulate the media. And so you have this, politicians, media owners, and landowners are often in the same single person. And you have a great concentration of the media in Brazil, as you also have in the US. We know about the Koch brothers and others, the Murdoch empire, right? So there's been this great concentration of media ownership around the world. And in Brazil, it's also concentrated in 5 to 6 families that own 70% of Brazil's major media outlets. And it's a system that was set in place in 1962, and the laws for telecommunications. So the system has not been changed since 1962. So this is before the internet, before all these changes that now are shaping the world, and that have been very, very important in Bolsonaro coming into power recently, which I'll assume that you all know, and you know that the forest fires have been going on. So they have a system in Brazil where media bosses occupy 1 in 10 seats in the House of Representatives, 1 in 3 seats in the Senate. The agricultural lobby is the strongest lobby force in the government, and there's no transparency about their activities. Television licensing is used by politicians to serve their personal interests, and there's no public input, no transparency. So here's an analyst of analysts of mass media in Latin America as a whole that says mass media in most Latin American societies are controlled by a small elite that uses the media's definitional power to further, consciously or unconsciously, a set of class and family-based interests and ideologies that have helped maintain a status quo of social inequality. So this is a vastly different impression of Brazilian media than what we got in the analysis that currently exists. And let's think about, so I've already talked about the sciences, so what is the role of the sciences? And this is a slide which just shows how much research is being carried out in the social sciences focused on environmental change or climate change. This was from a period from 2000 to 2010. So as you can see, North America and Western Europe. So most of the research is there. Latin America and the Caribbean is the second to last that you can see there. So there's almost no research on this. So this matters for thinking about, what do we even know about Brazilian media? This is how you can also have sort of rather poor understanding of what's actually going on in that country, because social sciences would help if we had more, if there was more of a concentration on understanding the social obstacles to better environmental policy. But it is very, very underfunded in Brazil and in other regions of the world. There was just a study out this year, so just some weeks back, which studied funding of climate research in 37 countries, and so looked at competitive grants and what was funded, and it found that 770% more funding went to the natural sciences than to the social sciences. So 770 times more goes to the natural sciences. So there's not a very strong emphasis on social science in this area. And what exists of the social science, according to this study, when it came to mitigation, so actually reducing climate change, only 0.12% of the funding goes to that. So our understanding of the social and political dimensions are going to be limited if we don't have a lot of scientific knowledge being produced about it. So that's also something you can think about. Okay, how does that happen? Who makes the decisions about science policy, and making, how can we understand that there is not so much research on this? And there's a bigger question. It's not only about money, but it's about money, and it's also about notions of what is worthy research. So for example, here, this is from a program. So this shows how the federal government in Brazil prioritizes and thinks about what is valuable in terms of knowledge for the country's future. This was a program of vast investment in Science Without Borders, which was funding, and when Brazil had money before the crash, in sending Brazilians abroad to get degrees, to get, to learn and to network in the world, gain from abroad. And the areas that were included were all in natural and technical, so natural science and technical areas of knowledge. There was not a single social science mentioned in this program that supposedly was to invest to advance the knowledge of society, to advance the knowledge society. So disheartening for social scientists, and imagine me in Brazil. So it's an uphill battle, right? It's worth fighting for, but it also matters that we even think about how do governments decide what to fund, right? And I've done research in Brazil on where the government has explicitly wanted to have control over the social science. They didn't care about the natural science, but the social science, they wanted to go through a government review to see that it wasn't politicized, that it wasn't inconvenient knowledge about the Amazon and the environmental dimensions in the Amazon. So there is control in that sense also of what kind of knowledge gets out into society. So in conclusion, what I've hoped that I have conveyed to you is that current scholarship on climate skepticism is North-centric. It doesn't capture what's going on in Brazil. It is very shaped by what's going on in the US, where climate skepticism has a certain shape. And so analysts will go out and find and look at Brazil as if it would manifest itself in the same way in Brazil. But what I've shown, I hope, is that skepticism manifests itself differently in Brazil. And so we can say in different country contexts. Brazil's anti-environmentalism is at least as influential as in the US, I argue. And the structural power is similarly exercised in the two countries through elite control of government and mass media. So in Brazil, in strong alignment with agricultural and meat production interests. More than explicit debunking, which also has grown in recent years, this power involves upstream suppression of environmental information that is inconvenient. The Brazilian government, media, and even scientists and NGOs are trapped in an unsustainable system wrapped in the illusion that the region's extractivist economic model offers a viable pathway towards positive political, social, and economic transformations, and even sustainability. And this is a little bit of advertising for my talk on Thursday. To say we need to reform media systems as a meta-level approach to environmental policy. We need to step up and look higher up and understand how people, even the way people understand the problems, are shaped by systems that need to be reformed, and media is one of them. And explore how mass media and now artificial intelligence can support the process of becoming a learning society, rather than be used to further inequality and environmental destruction. If you want to hear more about that, come on Thursday. So, if you have questions?
Questions?
That's what I do.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. It was excellent. My name is Olivia. I have a question. So has there been any effort from the beef industry to decrease the detrimental effects on climate change, yet increase the yield of meat? Because so far from your presentation, it seems like there's these two very absolute situations. It's either you stop or decrease meat production and you save the environment, or it's you continue on with the beef industry and they do nothing in terms of helping the environment. So I'm curious, has there been any effort to have a middle ground? Because in America, which I can speak for, is that the dairy industry has definitely made efforts to decrease their effects. I mean, in the past few years, they decreased their number of cattle from 25 million to 9 million, and yet still increased their yield. So it's almost like the best of both worlds. And I've wondered if the beef industry in Brazil has made that effort at all.
Yes, yes. So what is, am I still on? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So that is the focus in Brazil, is on intensification. So I mentioned that briefly, but too quickly perhaps. So to the extent that there's recognition of it as a problem, they look to how can you produce more meat on land that is already deforested. And that is really important, and there's great potential in that. So even environmentalists and people I admire and respect, they really focus on that. And that may be the limit of where you can go right now in Brazil, just because it's politically, it's very difficult to talk about. And you can gain a lot just through that route. A lot can be gained. But you have, I mean, so you have other studies. The intensification comes with its own problems as well. Then you have higher use of antibiotics. The thing is that in Brazil, among many things, so the methane, there are other problems that come with it. That said, in Brazil, there is so much potential in that route. So yes, there are things you can do, but it is a problematic, Another thing that they have been doing is also try to monitor where the cattle come from, because what they care about is illegal meat, which comes from when they have, there's a lot of use in the Amazon of public lands to raise cattle. And so they've been trying to monitor what cows come from that versus the ones that come from legitimate, like legal production. And then, but it's very complicated to actually do in practice. So.
Hi, my name is Oliver. I had some questions about following the election of Jair Bolsonaro as president. What have been the changes to this rhetoric?
To this rhetoric being which?
The kind of, because he ran on this campaign of anti-climate rhetoric and extremely right-wing campaign. What has been the change in, for example, like the government rhetoric and the media rhetoric in regards to climate change?
Very important change, very, very big change. Even, so we had an interim government before Jair Bolsonaro under Temer, and under Temer, they would still say there is no space for climate skepticism, even in the world, the foreign minister would say. So they were still holding this line that skepticism doesn't exist, the environment is something to do. But with Jair Bolsonaro, that really changed. There were elements of that before with Minister Post, even science technology, which was my minister in Brazil, was actually a climate skeptic at one point. So they exist, but under Jair Bolsonaro, the leader of the of the external relations of the foreign ministry, and also the environment minister are self-declared skeptics. And so that was shocking to the world, and Jair Bolsonaro also. So they just rebuke, they just think that it's a plot again by foreign powers against Brazil, which is an interesting trope about kind of an anti-imperialist strand of skepticism in Brazil, where they see it as this is the Americans, because the Brazil and the US are very much in competition when it comes to agricultural production. And so they perceive, and I think, I wouldn't say unrightly so, I mean, that there are certain factions, certainly in the US, that wouldn't mind if Brazil was not producing so well. So you can understand one element that they're suspicious, but of course, to think that the whole environmental discourse and arguments is just a fiction is very convenient. And you have these people now all of a sudden in positions of power who had this position. It was very shocking to the world, because we've been seeing and being told about Brazil in these very overly positive way, is what my argument with you all. And what I want to say also is that the social sciences didn't prepare us. We didn't see this coming because we weren't picking up on the signals of this really existing, because it was also, and so there are some people now, like Eduardo Viola, who's a Brazilian political scientist, who says that there's been this myth about Brazil as being so green, et cetera. It's not been quite as beautiful as it was before, as we painted it before, right? But we were not prepared for what happened with Jair Bolsonaro. We didn't see it coming.
Why is it that the profits from the meat industry in Brazil only remain at the top and don't trickle down?
So the pockets?
Profits.
Okay, so can you repeat, sorry?
Why is it that the profits from the meat industry don't trickle down through society and only remain at the top?
Well, of course, to some extent. I mean, it's a relative question. But what's happening is that to have the high production, high yield monocrop agriculture, you need vast areas, very expansive areas. So there's a pressing out of the small farmers, to take over their lands. And that in Brazil, we still have the Wild West. I mean, it's literally with violence often along that. And, so right now we have a lot of fights also with they're taking over the indigenous land, which they can't by law, but they do it with power. But so there has been a concentration of land ownership with large landowners. So you can see that the really, really big properties have gone up rather than down, because people then get pushed off of the land and then they become the urban poor. So they lose their livelihoods, where the small farmers actually they're the ones who produce the majority of the food that's on Brazilians. That's something like 75% of the food that's in the Brazilian tables come from the small farmers. And the small farmers tend to have a more diverse, they don't do the monocrop as much. There's more, you also have agroecology, so alternative types of farming, but that gets pressed out. That said, I mean, there is a rise also in organic farming, and so it's not all bleak. There are some changes in that respect. But as a whole, it's a paradigm where you have more and more mechanization and less use for labor. So one way you could overcome that would be like if you focus on fruits, where you tend to need more labor. But currently, when it's in soy, and you just don't need many people to take care of them.
I had a question.
There.
I was curious, you talked a lot about specifically beef and cattle and the impact that has on climate change and the emissions produced by that. I was wondering though about other crops, for example, almonds, which are grown quite a bit in California, require lots of water, even though that's an area which is currently facing lots of drought and having issues with the amount of water that is needed for the crops there. So I was wondering if there's other products which we're consuming at increasing rates that we might not be as aware about as beef, and that are still very important to us, either as global citizens or as Americans.
Yeah. I think it's a more comment. I think your comment, your identification of almonds, I think is a good example. So people now are saying go to like oat milk rather than almond milk, because, etc. So maybe others have other examples.
Yeah, so you mentioned that there are certain incentives in science that refrain some people from taking on certain topics. So do you find yourself in like the same kind of situation with some of the works that you do?
Good question. Yes, I do. And I'm still a Brazilian researcher. So I'm a professor at Wageningen University in the Netherlands, but I'm still a Brazilian researcher as well. And I do worry about speaking up about this, because there are these perceptions that we need meat for the economy. And especially as a foreigner, where I will be perceived as sort of an American or Danish agent that is undermining Brazil. So I am even more vulnerable in raising that in Brazil. But I think that we need to do that. And so we need to also make Brazilians understand that what's happening actually, so Silicon Valley is investing in alternative meats. So people, and like I mentioned, the NASDAQ and the whole financial sector, realizing the meat sector can be troubled, so it can be bad investment. So Brazilians need to know this so that they can make the best planning for their own economy and future, right? So I think there's a way to counter it, but it is sensitive to bring it up. And so as researchers, we have to think about the consequences. To some extent, have courage, but also try to be smart. Sometimes it's also maybe not the most strategic thing to bring up in certain contexts, right? So maybe talking about intensification is the best strategy for now. I didn't bring up, so I talked about scientists, but also NGOs. So NGOs are not talking about this, right? And they care very much about the forest. But so there are strategies, and reasons why. But that doesn't mean that those conditions should be unquestioned, right? For why it's difficult for people to raise this issue. Yeah.
In Mexico, there's a similar issue, as I'm sure you know, of political tensions and inconvenient truths surrounding environmentalism. Activists and scientists involved in butterfly conservation, and more recently, avocado production, now being called blood avocados are being kidnapped and assassinated. As it relates to knowledge surrounding meat production and consumption, do you think Brazil is on a similar path? And what, in your opinion, should be done to help make scientists' voice be heard?
Wow. Well, I don't think I can do that analysis on my feet. I need a little more information before I can do an analysis, but I think you're right to point out that there are other products that are problematic, and it comes with abuses of human rights and ignorance about what's best for a country, for people, right? So, I mean, there are lots. Brazil has some of the highest level of assassinations of nature defenders, and so you know, it is bloody in that sense also in Brazil. So I think it's already happening. I don't know how to weigh it against what's going on in the other places. You know, we would have to have some stronger definition of terms.
Hi. So you mentioned social sciences a lot in order to like prevent climate change. Could you give us like some examples of like some specific areas of social science where we could like study more? Yeah.
Okay. Social science specifically around the environment, or climate change, or media, or anything? Wow, that's a big question. Well, there are people you can look up. Andy Sterling, it's very good. They're at an institute in the UK. Ian Scoones, Scoones, has written a lot about agriculture, power, and framing. Very good. I mean, there's a vast body out there. See if I can think of some place to kind of, you know, there's a nice, I didn't bring it up here, The Social Heart of Climate Change, of Global Environmental Change by Hackman and all. That was in Nature Climate Change some years back. The Social Heart. And if you put that in, Social Heart, Nature Climate Change, you will see a very nice pitch for why social sciences are so important and why they should be emphasized more in global environmental change than they are.
Hi.
Yeah, hi.
I know you mentioned, I guess, like the economy as being a reason why some Brazilians.
Mentioned who?
You mentioned the economy as being a reason why a lot of Brazilians say that meat production and consumption is very important. But I was wondering what you think about the importance of like culture interacting with like food and meat, and if you've seen any research like looking at balancing decreasing meat production for environmental sustainability, but then also like, I guess, keeping meat dishes around for the importance of, I guess, like protecting culture and especially like indigenous dishes and things like that.
Meat is very important to the Brazilians. If you have, everyone been to Brazil will know that people don't say, do you want to have dinner? They want to say, do you want to have a barbecue? That it's so associated with sociality and good food, etc. So it's a very strong value, cultural value, assumption that it's necessary for health. So that you will actually be unhealthy if you don't eat meat. These are cultural perceptions, and they're very, very strong. I personally, you know, I don't think that we need to entirely eliminate meat consumption. We need to get it into, you know, a more sustainable line. So where, you know, I would like to see a scientific study that defines exactly how that is best done. So I don't know exactly how to say, you know, what is the right level, but I think we can still maintain these cultural things, but we can also slowly change culture. I think there's maybe a little too much of a tendency, not, you know, sort of in the literature to think if it's cultural, it doesn't change, but cultures do change, right? They can change, you know, and one of the things we have to do now to address sustainability is actually to think about how can we achieve that in a way that's not just brainwashing people, right? But how can we inform people and give them an incentive to change? That's why I had that quote also saying that knowledge is literally power, and this is what we see when people know there is a tendency to change. So you can change, it's slow, you know, but it can happen.
Hi. Okay. I just spent a month in Australia, and they're having the whole forest, the bushfires that were like really devastating. I traveled like up and down the coast, and I saw like for like 2 hours like nothing like existed pretty much. And Brazil just had the fires in the Amazon that kind of changed the dialogue on social media. And when I was in Australia, I noticed that social media, the dialogue that happened on like stuff like Facebook or things that I just was exposed to was a lot different than what I heard here. Have you looked at all into how like the dialogue on social media has changed since the Amazon fires and how it can be used to drive the change that you're talking about?
I can't say that I've monitored it as such. The social media are increasingly important in terms of circulating misinformation. So there was a study just out about climate skepticism, for example, and it found that there was 50 times more misinformation in the social media compared to like the mainstream media. So you actually didn't have that many skeptical voices, for example, in the media, but in the social media, they were rampant. So I don't know if you were thinking in a negative way or in a positive way about the social media, but that is what we are facing now, is that the social media circulate misinformation at a great rate and can target populations with specific messages that these populations are receptive to, right? And I mean, a study found that 75% of adult Americans believe, that adult Americans believe 75% of the misinformation that they are fed. So there's a high level of actual acceptance misinformation through the social media. So I see the social media as a problem, but of course they also circulate lots of knowledge that we need. It's the hard thing is fostering the good uses and not the bad uses. I'm not sure exactly. There was the last part of your question maybe I didn't get.
Yeah, like specifically in the industry, Australia does actually have a pretty big cattle industry as far as their beef. That was the biggest, that was a really big concern when I saw they were always talking about cattle farmers and losing livestock, and that was one part. But in Brazil, where they have like obviously a large dairy industry, has it shifted the dialogue over to that industry at all?
Over to it, so favoring
specifically post the fire.
against the industry, you mean, or for the industry? I don't know how to answer, so I can just, I don't know what has happened in the social media. I'm not sure that this study exists. Getting back to what do we even know, right? What studies are being made? I'm interested myself in exploring it. As a whole, I haven't found a lot on meat or sort of, reducing meat in the social media, which makes sense if you think about that there's not, even the NGOs are not going in that direction. So where would this push come from of information of reducing meat? But I'm not sure what you mean by going to the industry or for the industry or against. Okay.
So I think we should wrap it up here. If you asked a question and you want credit, please come up and sign a sheet. The keyword for today is guard dog with a question mark. And let's thank Myanna again.
Thank you.